Hi, this is Marco Pimentel. Welcome to the podcast, Someone Like You. In this first season, you'll discover founders, creators, entrepreneurs, and business owners who are passionate about creating business models with lasting, sustainable climate solutions.
Is there a future version of this where there's a carbon neutral food aisle at every grocery store and where consumers can readily find carbon neutral staples, where transparency in commodity food systems enables producers delivering a climate benefit to be fairly compensated? I think we very much see our role as a company in building that capacity. And if we're not aiming for scale, then we're kind of wasting our time.
Milk. It's a very popular product. We put in our coffees, we use it for our cereals, we run to the grocery store late at night because we might run out. But milk and animal products are also a hot topic when it comes to our climate. And a lot of money, nearly almost $50 billion, will be poured in the next 5 years into plant-based options when it comes to milk. And currently in 2020, about 15% of all our retail sales, which makes up about $2.5 billion, is towards plant-based. But when we think about what do we invest in, is it plant-based options? Is it on our farming practices? And how we're going to be better? It's likely probably going to be everything. And that brings me to this week's episode. Joining me is Ann Radil, head of carbon reduction at Nutrol. Nutrol is the first carbon neutral food company in the United States on a mission to radically reduce the carbon footprint of agriculture, starting with dairy farming. Carbon neutral milk is certified carbon neutral, pasture-raised on family farms, certified organic, no GMOs, no synthetic hormones, no toxic pesticides, and no antibiotics. Its products taste good, and they're good for the planet. Nutrol does this by working with farmers on new innovative research projects that help to reduce the amount of carbon that is released through sequestration, regenerative farming practices, manure management, and the change to the cow's diet. Nutrol has also been fortunate enough to be funded by Bill Gates, Mark Cuban, Lebron James, musician John Legend. The list goes on. They've been fortunate to get this funding because they believe in the mission that they're creating. Ann is an ex-NASA-funded climate scientist and fifth-generation rancher who's incredibly passionate about climate-friendly initiatives. Here's our conversation. Well, Ann, thanks very much for joining me today.
Yeah, very happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, Nutrol, so you're the head of carbon reduction, ex-NASA-funded climate scientist. Your family has a rich history in farming. You're a fifth-generation rancher. I'd love to just understand what kind of inspired you to take this role, and then just your main responsibility as head of carbon reduction at Nutrol.
Yeah. Thanks for such a great question. I was inspired to take this role at Nutrol because it's really the culmination of so many of my personal and professional experiences. So, as you mentioned, my family's been ranching for a long time, and at a young age, I really understood ranchers to be conservationists and stewards, and saw that when farmers and ranchers manage land for ecosystem health and healthy communities, we all benefit. So I studied environmental science, led to graduate work in climate change science. I was a research assistant on a part of a NASA mission called the Earth Observing System. And from that technical background, I started consulting to companies on their sustainability and climate change initiatives. So I worked with Coca-Cola and IBM and in-house at Nike. And really the chance to join and start Nutrol was the chance to build a new kind of company and a new food system. It was really the chance to connect with what I care most about, with what I know how to do. And so my role at Nutrol, I'm the head of carbon reduction, and that means that I lead our work to account for the climate impact of all of our products. And then I manage a portfolio of carbon reduction projects happening at farms. This is the work that we're scaling across dairies to help producers adopt climate smart practices.
Well, and from a mission perspective, what is Nutrol's overall mission? And I guess why was it created, and like what kind of gap was there that it was trying to fill?
Yeah. So I guess, at the simplest, kind of highest level, why Nutrol? In in 2019, there was this, small group of misfits who saw that the food system is part of the problem. Today agriculture contributes between 21 and 37% of global greenhouse gas emissions, depending which IPCC report you're citing. And we also saw that the food system can be part of the solution. So we know that solutions exist to reduce the carbon footprint of agriculture, but that there are barriers to adopting those solutions. And so we saw the opportunity to start neutral as a way to bridge the gap. And so our mission is threefold. It's to reward producers who are willing to do the hard work for adopting climate smart practices. It's to fight climate change by scaling these climate smart agricultural practices. And it's also to meet consumers where they're at. So providing carbon neutral options for the staples that are found in most homes today. So, we know that many people are concerned about climate change. And according to research, over 90% of US households have dairy milk in their fridge, for example. So we're giving folks the chance to make their climate conviction personal, and making a decision as simple as, what milk you pull off the carton to reflect and support producers in helping them to adopt no and low emitting practices.
And has there been any initiatives through government organizations that have been trying to work with the farmers, or do you think it's the combination of Neutral's brand, putting it right at the intersection of the shelves and the consumers and people wanting to have that is allowing this connection between Neutral, the consumer, and then the farmers? Do you think is that the missing thing or the missing link there, and
Yeah,
why it was created?
yeah, that's a great question. There's a couple different pieces there. So there's absolutely fantastic like state and federal programs that exist to help farmers adopt some of these practices. I think that from our perspective, what's been missing was a group that is wholly dedicated to understanding what are all the tools in the toolkit that are available to support producers in making these changes. So we source our milk from really small family-owned pasture-based systems with an average herd size of 70 cows. A lot of the state and federal incentives reward really large dairy producers today. So how can we serve, kind of these family farmers in a way that's really unique? And I think that when it comes to a lot of commodities, the fantastic work that's done upstream is lost somewhere in that process. So by nature that we have total transparency to which are the farms that are sourcing our milk that ends up in our cartons, we can make a very clear value proposition to the consumer of your purchase is rewarding these farmers for these specific practices. And so it's filling the gap in terms of providing, a lot of tools to help farmers adopt these practices. So, financial access is a significant hurdle, but not the only one. Mentorship and education is a significant hurdle, but not the only one. We've got great state and federal tools that are taking bites of those apples, so to speak. And the piece that Neutral brings is like understanding all of those barriers, and in some cases, even providing the direct project management or oversight. So if producers are really busy and we're saying, hey, we'd love to support you in adopting these, let's help fund it. Let's put you in touch with the professionals who can really de-risk implementation of this climate smart practice. And let's take on some of the burden and the labor associated with that adoption, so that consumers have total confidence and total transparency. My purchase has an impact, and the impact is helping to scale those climate smart practices. Yeah.
Yeah, and allows the farmers to see that direct impact from those shelves and that direct demand as well. As demand of that product grows, the farmers are going to feel a lot more comfortable to invest into their farm, into these practices, because they can see that demand being pulled from the consumers. So you had mentioned some of the farms that you work with. Are the farmers thinking about this when you started working with them originally? Were they starting to do some of these practices? Like, what type of farmers were you? You mentioned small scale, small herds, but
Yeah.
what are the type of farmers that you were working with when you started?
Yeah, so the farmers that we work with generally are mostly tethered to the production systems that we're sourcing from. So again, it's the small family owned pasture based, largely organic dairies that we work with today. And so as far as where those farmers' goals kind of intersect with the types of projects or climate smart practices that we want to fund, it it really varies across the board. We absolutely support some of those producers who are very early adopters and had already implemented a number of climate smart practices on their farm. In other cases, we're meeting producers kind of at the beginning of that journey who are saying, I think if you want to help me invest in solutions like that will also, improve my soil health or help me reduce nutrient loading when I'm dewatering my lagoon, et cetera. Like there are these very real pressing operational concerns that intersect with the climate smart practices Neutral wants to fund. And so those producers are very kind of interested in not only reducing their carbon footprint, but really in the co-benefits or the value that a lot of these projects deliver beyond climate. And in that case, the conversation starts from a very different place of instead of a farmer who's saying, hey, I've, adopted a lot of these practices and I know that the missing link is a solution to reduce enteric methane. That's a very different conversation from someone who's saying, hey, if you want to help me increase the value of my operations, I'm all about it. But what are the largest sources of emissions on my farm? And what are the solutions that are relevant? And so we really try to meet, I guess in that way, we're really trying to meet both our farmers where they're at, as well as our consumers where they're at. So we've got kind of two constituencies on either side.
Yeah, and I'd love to understand a little bit about the funding aspect. So, Bill Gates, Breakthrough Energy Ventures Fund invested in around. So great
Mhm.
to see such a prolific venture fund invest. How does that funding work? Is the funding mainly for building up Neutral's brand, working on research projects, or is it also funding individual farmers like on their farm projects that are helping them to do reduction, or how does that all work?
Yeah, great question. So yeah, we're really fortunate that in early kind of fundraising, we got a lot of support from Bill Gates backed Breakthrough Energy Ventures as well as Mark Cuban, and then we just closed this kind of celebrity round, if you will, and got some support from folks like Questlove and Lebron James and John Legend and all of this kind of cachet we don't typically associate with a milk brand.
Yeah.
But the benefit of that funding for us and the importance of finding folks who are really aligned with our mission is that it allows us to grow our business and then to make bigger bets to reduce the carbon footprint of agriculture than we would otherwise be able to make. And so, to answer your question, how do we use that funding? Is it actually directly supporting farmers and adopting these practices? Yes, absolutely. It's also helping us expand nationally. So, I think, we're currently available in the US at about 1,500 stores, and also in partnership with some home delivery groups like Imperfect Foods, who's been an awesome ally of us, or Fresh Direct. But getting that expansion off the ground takes resources. So building that brand and a consumer education and awareness of when we say this milk fights climate change and we're carbon neutral, what does that mean? All of that takes resources. Um, and of course the direct investment of the on-farm projects. I think what's for us also really amazing about having the backing and support of Breakthrough Energy Ventures is they're also investing in other companies and really amazing technologies that, when applied to agricultural systems, can reduce on-farm emissions. And so there becomes within kind of their portfolio of investments this unique relationship where Neutral can be an implementation arm and show those innovators, hey, the market exists. There is consumer demand for this food. We have farmers who want to adopt your practices, so we can kind of create a pull mechanism for some of their other bets. So, for example, Breakthrough just invested in a company called Yardstick, who's really improving how we actually measure, monitor, and verify claims around soil carbon, which to date has been a real area of interest for a lot of folks. But the science around how do we actually tether adoption of practice X to a Y increase in soil carbon is really technically challenging. So we at Neutral can also kind of partner with that other breakthrough group to say, let's work together to implement a practice at a farm where we're going to, manage soil in a different way, whether it's applying compost or reducing tillage or using different cover crops. And then Yardstick can be our measuring, monitoring, and verification partner.
Yeah, we had Desiree Dupuis of Cascadia Seaweed on the podcast. And one of the things that they're working on right now is a research project around seaweed used for food, for cows as well. And they're seeing that certain types of seaweed, it's a range between about, I think it's about 40 or 30% up towards like 90 to 95%. A certain type of seaweed could reduce burping from cows.
Yes.
And I'm sure you're probably maybe aware of that. And so, yeah, I see where that investment angle in one can then push, the demand into the other, and then that draw. So it's really exciting to see some of those things that are coming up. And so for farmers, when they partner with Neutral, I guess there's a great opportunity to work with, people like yourselves and your team that are bringing in expertise. You're potentially bringing in funding to allow them to do these things that might cost some money.
Hmm.
And is that a fairly large draw for the farmers in terms of just the switching to some of these opportunities to reduce their climate emissions?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the incentive for farmers is that, one, we want to pay them more for the product that they produce, and that in and of itself is very appealing. But I think in the other piece, like, there's not too many, like, there's so many different um, NGOs or agencies or others that are providing part of the solution, whether it's access to funding, whether it's mentorship and education, whether it is that kind of critical project management oversight that producers need in some cases to bring these projects to life. And so I think what they find in Neutral is just a willing and excited and eager partner to meet them where they're at and invest in solutions that reduce emissions, but also, by the way, increase the value of their operations over time. So, to make this a little bit more concrete, perhaps it would be helpful if I talked a little bit with more specificity about the types of projects that we're actually investing in.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah. Okay. So, we've identified dozens of potential projects or climate smart practices that we'd like to invest in. So we talk to folks that are, we have fantastic academic partners, fantastic research allies. We bring together kind of the best available thinking of, what are those solutions or those kind of tools in our toolkit, so to speak, to radically reduce on-farm greenhouse gas emissions. And so what are the largest sources of on-farm emissions and where do those mitigation opportunities exist? And so on some dairy farms, just to make this like much more, hopefully a little bit more concrete, on some dairy farms, we're reducing greenhouse gas emissions by changing what cows eat. So, as you mentioned, the seaweed supplementation trial, we're actually going to kick off our own seaweed supplementation trial with a project with a producer called Symbrosia, and Colorado State University is going to be our partner for kind of measuring the effectiveness of that. So, we're very interested in that. But that's not the only strategy to change what cows eat that can then reduce the enteric methane, or essentially how the critters in their stomach are acting in behaving that affects the methane that they're burping into the atmosphere. And so we know that, for example, specific types of grasses and forbs contain higher than average concentrations of tannins. So when you take a bite of a pear that's not quite ripe, or wine that you're like, something's off, it's not quite ready, what you're tasting is these secondary metabolites called tannins, which are naturally produced in plants, and when eaten by cows, reduce enteric methane production. They have kind of a natural antimicrobial effect, and they also impact how cows process nitrogen. So by optimizing forage, or the species of grasses and forbs grown in pasture for tannins, we can reduce a cow's climate impact. And there are real co-benefits here, like less bloating, reduced oxidative stress, and more and better milk production, which of course our farmers are pretty thrilled about. So, cows that consume these tannins have a higher kind of functional nutritional, that they have better nutrition, and that functional value is passed on to their milk. So that's that is one of the on-farm carbon reduction project types that we're investing in. For other dairies, we're reducing greenhouse gas emissions by improving how manure is managed. So specifically, we're investing in equipment that helps farmers better separate and compost manure solids, which alone can reduce manure-related greenhouse gas emissions like methane and nitrous oxide by 19 to up to 50%, while also delivering these great co-benefits, right? So if we can find these solutions that can reduce a farm's operational emissions and add real value, or develop projects that can increase the ability for these farms to act as natural carbon sinks by, for example, planting more trees or adopting practices that put more carbon into soil, we are able to deliver some solutions that benefit the farmers, solutions that benefit our consumers who care. And yeah, we're just really excited about continuing to support farmers in this work. And our goal is to become, the best in the world at reducing the carbon footprint of agriculture. And this is kind of the tack we're taking to get there.
Every week on Someone Like You, we dive into stimulating conversations with founders, entrepreneurs, business owners, and the likes who are consciously and successfully creating sustainable business solutions for the long haul. Tune in every week for a new inspiring conversation on leading climate solutions. And if you're enjoying the podcast, don't forget, please subscribe on the platform of your choice and give us a rating and a review. And when you think about some of the projects as well, you hear a lot about regenerative farming. And so being able to take some of that carbon in the air, the plants grab it and then basically store it into the ground. Is that a major part of what Neutral is doing with the farmers right now, or is that in its kind of early kind of research stage?
Yeah, so it's absolutely like the practices that loosely fall under kind of like regenerative practices or practices that farmers adopt to improve soil health. Those are absolutely kind of some of the practices that we seek to scale. I think from our perspective at Neutral, when we look at all of the practices or all of the levers that we could bring and partner with farmers to deliver, to develop on their farms, to reduce on-farm emissions, the practices where we're avoiding emissions or reducing emissions, those can be easier to verify. So by that, what I mean is you can imagine that our relationship building or our process can look like meeting a farmer, understanding, his or her unique goals for their property, given the unique attributes of that farm, what opportunities exist to either reduce emissions or improve kind of soil sequestration. Where and how do regenerative practices fall into that mix? And then what is needed? Like, what are the existing barriers to adoption? Do they just need more money to buy perhaps new equipment to help them till in a different way? Do they need mentorship and education to understand what sort of biodiverse plants they could plant, or what opportunities exist to, convert an incised riverbank to a riparian buffer? So there's a number of different places where we can flex those, like explore those solutions. And then on the other end, after that project is implemented, regeneration is a fantastic opportunity. From our perspective, there's just a lot of on the ground measurement and verification that is needed for us to tether adoption of this quote unquote regenerative practice led to this, Y GHG benefit. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. And I think obviously measurement being quite a challenge with a lot of these different things, but understanding that is part of the overall process when you mix it with all the different opportunities that the individual farm may have as well, which is quite unique too. Every carton of Neutral milk has this slogan, "This milk fights climate change." I'd say it's pretty bold. I'm on the marketing side and branding, so I love it. And how did that come to be? And how did buyers and consumers receive it?
Yeah, well, thanks so much. Yeah, so let's see. So we know that it's really important. Branding and design are really important today, and today's brandings, they're important in today's retail landscape, especially in a crowded category like milk, and especially as a new company with a very novel mission. There's a lot of there's the terms carbon negative or carbon positive or carbon neutral. Like, what different companies use those terms in different ways, not just companies, different people, different organizations use those terms in different ways. And so I think this milk fights climate change is is a way of us trying to, as you said, make a bold statement, and one that is hopefully easy for consumers to, at face value, and understand. And I think most important, we want that messaging to fit within a design that catches your eye, so you want to pick up the carton and turn it over, learn a bit more, and give it a try. So we've received a lot of positive feedback from retailers and consumers about our branding so far, which is fantastic. Um, yeah, yeah, and we're always, seeking to find new and better ways to make sure that people understand this is not a marketing ploy. Their decision to purchase this product is about driving meaningful change.
Yeah, and I love the word fights, right? Because that's essentially what neutral is doing. It's has not solved milk and climate change.
Mhm.
It's fighting towards what that solution is, and it's impactful. So, and when it comes to the end result and the end product, using these improvements in its food, we talk a little bit about the foraging. I'm assuming all of this just essentially leads to good quality end result of the product.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, if our product doesn't taste good and it's not exceptional, and as far as milk goes, then we there's nowhere to go from there. Like, the quality of the product is first and foremost. I think then what differentiates us and is really this kind of unique value proposition about the how behind that product, and the rigor that we apply to measuring and then eliminating the climate impact of that product.
Yeah. On a product as well on your website, you have the measurement of what that product has for its carbon footprint. How does that come to be in terms of that measurement number and applying that? It's probably a pretty complicated process, but just understanding that number and how Neutral comes up with it.
Yeah, yeah, you bet. So, when it comes to the calculation of our footprint, we're really fortunate to rely on our chief science advisor. His name is Dr. Greg Toma. He's one of the seminal experts in the carbon footprint space. He's dedicated 12 years uh, to researching the carbon footprint of a gallon of milk in the U.S. and has studied over 500 dairy farms from cradle to grave in that pursuit. And so, building on all of that research, Dr. Toma fine tunes his models and calculations to give us a kind of bespoke life cycle assessment of our carbon footprint, for each of our products, that reflects kind of the uniqueness of our supply chain and our sourcing. And the result is this robust and, we think, very conservative estimate of for each of our products based on each product's life cycle and characteristics. So these estimates that Dr. Toma provides, or his life cycle assessment, includes everything from the greenhouse gas emissions of the fertilizer on farm, to the cows and the methane they burp, to the trucks that transport the milk to where it's put in cartons, the energy that's used to process it, the packaging it goes into, everything at retail, everything at your home, even what happens when you dispose of the carton. Like, how often are we selling milk in places where that carton is likely to be recycled versus incinerated versus landfilled? So, as broad as this life cycle is, it's also really deep. So, for example, the retail portion of the value chain includes estimates of things like the leakage rate in the dairy aisle refrigerators as indecisive people are opening and closing the doors all day, right? Or the estimate of how far the average consumer drives round trip to go get milk, and how much of that drive can we shoulder on our product footprint, given that sometimes you go to the grocery store just to buy milk. Sometimes you go to the grocery store to stock up on all your staples for the next month. So, Dr. Toma's foundational work, it's been cited, I think, over 395 times. That's the I mean, it's a he's it's very vetted. It's peer reviewed scientific literature, and we're really just very fortunate to have him on board as a scientific leader in the space.
Yeah. Wow. When we think about, it's obviously we're not going to offset our way to a solution. And when we think about neutral, the benefit here is you get this consumer demand. Consumers are paying for a good quality product. In turn, that money funds continuation of projects that will improve the entire cycle of how milk is potentially produced. And
Mhm.
how does it work right now in terms of, buying carbon removals or carbon offsets? And obviously the ultimate goal being is that, Neutral probably doesn't have to purchase any of those in the future at some point. So I'd love to just kind of get a little bit into just understanding what that looks like from purchasing carbon offsets or carbon removals. Where does Neutral play in that space? What are some of the projects that it's working on, and your view on using offsets into the future?
Yeah, that's such a great question. It's so I think, as a team of three starting out in this space, we were really fortunate to connect with some fantastic organic producers in the Pacific Northwest, to connect with some fantastic brand designers and retail partners to get our product on shelf. And so starting out purchasing carbon offsets to ensure that the life cycle impact of those products is completely eliminated at point of sale was absolutely a necessity. And we think, offsets will play an important part in us, initially bringing our products to market. But the beating heart of our company is and has to be about driving meaningful change on farms themselves. So, as you said, like, we're not going to offset our way out of this problem. We need to not outsource the complexity of reducing the carbon footprint of agriculture, but that's very much the mantle that we want to take on. And so, as we continue to develop these farm projects, and as we continue to make headway towards verifying the emission reductions that have happened, it's a necessity for us to, as quickly as we can, with total, kind of applying the best science and math in the process, get to a point where we're increasingly relying on the on-farm change that we're driving as the means for delivering a carbon neutral product to market. And we see ourselves as wanting to, wean our way off, if you if you will, from the reliance on offsets over time.
Yeah, I think there's too much being said and too much negativity in the use of offsetting or removal tools where it's a part of a tool.
Right.
It's a tool set right now, and if we could use that to get to where we need to be, obviously we need to show meaningful results along the way, but it is part of being a tool. So how does neutral milk compare in terms of climate friendliness against the dairy free alternatives? There's obviously a ton of alternatives right now: soy, oat, almond, hemp.
Right.
There's a lot. So how does neutral look to compare against those type of products?
Yeah. So I think I love what you said about offsets, and I love this kind of thinking of, it's not so much either or, it's it's more of the yes and. So we know that we don't have the luxury of just, chucking out solutions to the climate change crisis. We need all solutions on the table all the time. Offsets our role. Absolutely, plant-based diets have a role. I think when we think about how does neutral compare to plant-based alternatives, I think we think of, you know, great if there's, if there are more, and better low carbon options out there to meet people wherever they're at and whatever their unique dietary, goals and concerns are. I think, if the question is why is, how does neutral compare to plant-based alternatives, or how does neutral compare to others in the space? I think the way I consider that question is first about thinking about transparency. So with plant-based alternatives, they could be fantastic. And what are the metrics that are using to determine how fantastic they are? So I think it's useful to think about, measuring the entire footprint of products so we can actually compare, one to one what the carbon footprint of those products are, and then how brands are, working to reduce those emissions. And I think, of course, it's also important to consider the nutritional benefits of milk. And so, if I think about, my toddler, she loves her oat milk, but she also loves her dairy milk. And so I think, and I know that she's not unique. A lot of the research shows that people who purchase plant-based alternatives still have, some sort of animal-based protein in their fridge as well. And so, that's probably kind of an unsatisfactory answer to your question, but I think plant-based roles, have a role, and it's just a matter of kind of meeting people where they're at.
Yeah, no, it's a good it does. And I think when you think about how Plant-based, will it represent 100% of the dairy options in the future? Likely not. And so you need to come together where we want plant-based options to gain market share, but we also need options like neutral that are comparing themselves to the standard milk industry to also gain market share at the same time. So
Yeah,
no, I
absolutely.
think that absolutely does answer that question. So thinking about scale, I think a lot of times some of these products, some of these businesses are not easier. They're very difficult to do on a small scale. But when you think about larger scale, how does neutral play in that? Like the obviously right now 70 herds or 70 cows in a herd.
Right.
How does it could this roll out to these farms that have 100 head of cattle or
Yeah.
1,000 head of cattle?
Yeah, I think, when we think about the role of growth and scale, part of our focus right now on small farms is this is an area that is commonly cited by folks as like meaningful impact with that producer group who are traditionally underserved by kind of the existing state and federal, incentives in that space. So we wanted to fill that gap. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Like scale and impact are critical if we have a chance. And so we think about scale and impact a couple of different ways. I think we think about scale and impact both as you alluded to of how would we like what are the right technologies and solutions that would be applicable at much larger dairies. In addition to, we are a carbon neutral food company that is starting with dairy, but certainly not ending with dairy. And so, our ambition as a company is to work in the most impactful food categories that people eat a lot of. And in order to do that, we're going to have to expand into other areas as well. And I think, is there a future version of this where there's a carbon neutral food aisle in every grocery store and where consumers can readily find carbon neutral staples, where transparency in commodity food systems enables producers delivering a climate benefit to be fairly compensated? I think we very much see our role as a company in building that capacity. And if we're not aiming for scale, then we're kind of wasting our time.
Yeah, I love that statement. And we don't have a lot of time either. So it all aligns that we need to be doing these type of things. And consumers, we're not going to shop our way out of the issue. But when we do this and we are purchasing things, we should be purchasing the right type of things. And I think this is funding an opportunity to work with farmers in ways that allow us to have a product that we want to have in a way that is good for the environment. So I'm a huge fan of the book The Lorax, and
Mhm.
we're kind of getting towards the end of our time, and so I give it off often. I read it to my two boys, and the story is just about over resourcing and how a
Mhm.
simple child with a seed can change an outcome. And so, just from like a personal level, I'd love to know. People ask what can they do, and so what can people or businesses do essentially to help make their first step towards, reducing maybe their own climate impact or being impactful in the way that they, maybe the jobs that they work in or what they do. But just, I'd love to understand what your thoughts are on taking that first step.
I love that question so much. And I think that in terms of very tactical steps that someone can take, I mean, there's so many first steps. You can buy and grow sustainable food. You can invest in renewable energy and energy efficiency, insulate your home. You can nurture soils and grasslands. You can run for office or support an NGO, right? Like there's so many different ways to get involved. But um, I think that oftentimes this idea of, where do I start also tethers to a question that might be a little bit more existential of, where especially in the face of something as intimidating as climate change, do my choices really make an impact? And so I think that I encourage, in my own family with my own daughter, to kind of like borrow another childhood classic. I think that, Mr. Rogers advised the young kids watching his program of, hey, when you hear that the news is really scary, or when you feel a little, overwhelmed and you don't know where to begin, look for the helpers in the stories because they're always there. If there's a fire in a building, there's someone who's showing up to try to put it out. And so I think when it comes to the climate change crisis, I think that so much of it is about, for me personally, reminding myself, like looking for the helpers, being inspired by the helpers, and not feeling defeated in the process, and knowing that there's actually a lot of joy to be had in thinking about what I value and acting on those values and the decisions that I make. And so I think that the first choice or the first steps that people can make are there's so many. And I just hope that people can just always remember that, or feel empowered, as opposed to kind of getting sucked into doom scrolling and overconsumption, but like kind of like reconnecting personally of what sustains you, right?
Yeah, well, very, very well said. And I wanted just to say thank you for joining us and telling the story today of Neutral. And, I love this example of it's milk. You grab it probably once or twice a week. But what's happening in the background and working with small scale farmers to work on solutions that can then be scaled so that when you grab a carton of milk, you know that it's being produced in a way that is sustainable into the future. And so I'm excited to continue to see change makers like yourself and everything that everybody's doing at Neutral. And so congratulations on the early success. Obviously, there's lots of money and funding that are going into it. So I think there's a lot of people that are rooting for you and cheering you on. So I encourage people that when you see that bottle or that carton, of this milk fights climate change, grab it and support the change makers like Ann. And thank you very much for coming on today.
Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate your support and the opportunity to tell our story. So thank you.
This podcast is co-produced with The Brand is Female. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode of Someone Like You. And if you did, please share this. We're a new podcast, and I would love it if you could share it with a family member, friend, colleague, work colleague. Share it on Slack, whoever you do. Just share and spread the message of these incredible brands. Please also support these type of companies. They're doing the hard thing, and the hard thing often takes a lot of people to get on board. And don't forget, please subscribe on the platform of your choice and give us a rating and review. I'm Marco Pimentel. Thank you for joining us today. For more information on Someone Like You, you can find us on Instagram at Someone Like You Podcast with all the links to the podcast, our website, and more information about the brands that we feature. Thank you again.